What do you do when the person who is supposed to protect you helps take everything away, then shows up at your door expecting a place to sleep? I stood on my own porch, keys still warm in my hand, and watched my sister's car roll up my driveway like she owned a piece of it too. Before I tell you what happened on that porch, if stories about family betrayal and quiet strength keep you watching, hit like right now, because this one earns it. Subscribe if you believe people should face what they've done, and share this with someone who's ever been called the strong one a little too often. My name is Renata Voss. I'm 36, and for the last 14 years I've built a landscaping and garden design business from nothing but a used pickup truck and a notebook full of sketches. I design gardens for people who want their backyard to feel like a place worth coming home to. It's slow work. It's patient work. You plant something small and you wait, sometimes for years, to see if it becomes what you imagined. I didn't know yet that my own life would ask the same thing of me. I married young at 24 to a man named Curtis Boyle. He sold commercial insurance, wore good suits, and had a way of making every room feel like it belonged to him. For the first few years, I told myself that was confidence. Later, I understood it was something closer to entitlement. Curtis believed that whatever space he stood in, whatever money passed through his hands, whatever person stood beside him, existed partly for his use. I was married to that belief for 9 years before I finally saw it clearly. My younger sister, Dana Voss Reyes, is 2 years behind me. Growing up, our mother had a phrase she repeated whenever something needed carrying. She'd look at me and say, "You're the steady one, Renata. Dana needs a little more help." I heard that sentence so many times it stopped sounding like praise. It started sounding like an assignment. I paid for Dana's community college tuition when our father's health insurance fell through. I co-signed her first apartment lease at 22. When her marriage to her first husband collapsed, I let her live in my spare room for 8 months with her son, Mateo, who was a toddler then. I never once asked her to pay me back, because that's not how sisters are supposed to keep score. At least, that's what I believed at the time. When my own marriage started cracking, 5 years ago, Dana was one of the first people I called. I told her about the late nights Curtis couldn't explain, the credit card statements he forgot to mention, the way he'd started talking about our house, the house I had put my own savings into, as something that was legally his because his name came first on the original loan. I told her everything, the way you tell a sister things you'd never tell a stranger, because you trust the room to stay private. I didn't know that room had a second door. The house at the center of all this sits on a quiet street in Millbrook, a town about 40 minutes outside Columbus. It's a modest 3-bedroom with good bones and a backyard I had spent 6 years slowly transforming into something close to a small nursery of my own, raised beds, a stone path I laid myself, a row of maple trees I planted the year we moved in. Curtis's name was on the original mortgage because his credit score had been better than mine back then. But over the following years, I had paid down more than half of that loan directly from my business account, money that came from my own labor, not his. I kept records. I've always kept records. It's a habit that would matter more than I could have guessed. When Curtis finally left, it wasn't dramatic. There was no dramatic scene, no screaming match in the driveway. He simply told me one evening, calm as ordering dinner, that he'd met someone and that he wanted the house sold so he could take his share. I remember standing in the kitchen holding a wooden spoon, feeling strangely calm myself, the way you feel calm right before you understand how much trouble you're actually in. I hired a lawyer named Priya Anand, a sharp, direct woman who specialized in property division in cases where one spouse had contributed unequal amounts of documented labor and money toward a shared asset. She told me my case had real strength, because unlike most people, I had kept every receipt, every transfer record, every contractor invoice for the renovations I'd paid for myself. Ohio courts, she explained, do consider financial contribution and the source of funds when dividing marital property, even when only one name sits on the original deed. My case wasn't guaranteed, but it wasn't weak either. It would come down to evidence, and evidence, more than emotion, would decide who kept that house. If you've ever had to prove, with paperwork, that your own life belonged to you, drop the word proof in the comments below, because I think you'll understand exactly what that felt like by the end of this story. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the moment, because what happened in that courtroom is the part that still makes my hands cold. The trial date landed on a gray morning in late October. I sat beside Priya at a long table, my folder of records stacked neatly in front of me, feeling as prepared as a person can feel while watching 9 years of their life get sorted into categories by strangers. Curtis's lawyer called his witnesses first, a colleague from his office, a neighbor who barely knew us, and then a name I did not expect to hear called from that list. Dana Voss Reyes. I turned in my seat and watched my sister walk to the witness stand wearing a navy dress I'd never seen before, her eyes fixed somewhere past my shoulder, refusing to meet mine. She was sworn in. She sat down. And then, in a voice that sounded rehearsed, careful, almost apologetic in its delivery, but not in its content, she told the court that I had, in her words, always talked about the house as something Curtis handled, that I'd described myself as not really the money person in our marriage, and that she'd personally heard me say I was bad with finances and happy to let Curtis manage everything. None of it was true. Every dollar I'd put into that house, I'd tracked myself, in spreadsheets Dana had actually seen years earlier, back when she still lived in my spare room and used to tease me about how organized I was. She knew the truth better than almost anyone outside that marriage. And she stood in front of a judge and handed Curtis's lawyer exactly what he needed to make my financial contributions sound like a fantasy I'd invented after the fact. During the recess, I found her by the water fountain in the hallway. I didn't raise my voice. I asked her one question, why she wouldn't look at me at first. Then she said quietly, "Curtis helped Marco with the trucking loan last year. I didn't think it would matter this much." Marco was her second husband. The trucking loan was $11,000. My sister had traded my 9 years of marriage, my proof of ownership over a house I had built with my own hands, for $11,000 of quiet help from the man trying to take it from me. I didn't cry in that hallway. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect tears in moments like this, and sometimes what actually shows up instead is a kind of cold clarity. I walked back into that courtroom and I let the paperwork speak, because paperwork, unlike people, doesn't change its story to protect itself. The ruling came 3 weeks later. Judge Holloway's written decision was careful and specific. She noted that despite testimony questioning my financial involvement, the documented evidence, bank transfers, contractor invoices, tax records, showed a clear and substantial pattern of my direct financial contribution to the property's value over the preceding 6 years. The house was awarded to me, with Curtis receiving a cash settlement reflecting his smaller documented share, payable over 18 months. I kept the walls, the raised beds, the maple trees I'd planted with my own hands. I kept the address. What I didn't keep, not fully, not the way it used to be, was my sister. We're a little past the middle of this story now, and I want to pause and thank you for staying with me this far. If you believe people who quietly do the right thing eventually get their answer, tap that like button once, and once more for anyone in your life who's ever had to defend their own truth in a room full of people who should have simply believed them. It helps this story find the people who need it. And if you haven't subscribed, do it now, because what happened 5 months later, in my own driveway, is the part of this story I still think about almost every day. For those 5 months, Dana and I didn't speak, not out of some dramatic vow of silence, just a quiet, mutual distance that felt easier than confrontation. I focused on the house. I finished the stone path along the side yard. I planted new perennial beds where the old grass had gone patchy, the kind of slow, hopeful work that made the place feel less like a battlefield and more like mine again. My business grew steadily that spring. Word spreads fast in a small town when someone does honest work, and by early summer I had more client requests than I could take on alone. Then, on a warm Saturday morning in June, I heard tires on my gravel driveway before I saw the car. It was Dana's minivan, dusty from a long drive, and when the side door slid open, out came her 2 kids, Mateo, now 11, and his little sister Isla, 7, both dragging small suitcases behind them like they'd done this before. Dana climbed out of the driver's seat already smiling, already talking. The way people talk when they've rehearsed a script on the drive over and are hoping momentum will carry them past the part where you might say no. Renata, thank God, she said well. King toward my porch steps like the conversation was already settled. Marco and I are done. Really done this time. The kids can take the guest room. I'll figure out the couch. It's just for a little while. You have all this space now. You have all this space now. I heard the whole shape of our family's old belief folded into that one sentence. The idea that whatever I had built belonged, at least partly, to whoever needed it most urgently. I looked past her at Matteo, standing quietly by the van with his suitcase handle gripped in both hands, and at Isla, already wandering toward my garden beds with the easy curiosity of a child who doesn't yet know she's part of a negotiation. My anger has never once been about them. But my sister was standing on my porch asking me to hand over the very thing a courtroom had just spent weeks confirming was mine, using the same soft, urgent tone she'd used on the witness stand to help take it away in the first place. No, Dana, I said, you can't stay here. She blinked, genuinely surprised, as if the word no belonged to a language she hadn't expected me to speak. Then she moved through her arguments one by one, the way people do when they've used the same arguments successfully before. First came the appeal to sisterhood. Remember when I let you stay with me? Remember how close we used to be? Then came the children. Look at their faces, Renata. Where am I supposed to take them? And finally, when neither of those worked, came the sentence I'd been half expecting since the moment her van rolled up my driveway. You'll be fine. You always land on your feet. That's just who you are. I felt something settle in me then, quiet and certain, like a stone finally finding its place in a wall. I was never fine because things were easy, Dana, I said. I was fine because I did the work myself, alone, while everyone assumed I didn't need anything. You stood in a courtroom and told a judge I didn't understand my own finances. I'm not handing you the one thing that proved you wrong. She called me cold. She said our mother would be ashamed of me. She said family was supposed to mean something. I told her family did mean something to me, which was exactly why I couldn't watch her walk into my house and treat it the same way she'd treated the truth in that courtroom, as something flexible, something that bent easily whenever it was inconvenient. She left angry, tires spitting gravel behind her, Isla waving at me through the back window with the confused, uncertain wave of a child who doesn't understand what the adults around her are actually fighting about. I stood in my driveway for a long time after the sound of her engine faded, feeling the specific, heavy quiet that comes after finally saying a true thing out loud. What I didn't know that day was how much worse things had actually gotten for her, and how much of it had nothing to do with me at all. 2 weeks later, I learned from our mother, who still speaks to both of us in careful, separate phone calls, that Marco had not simply left. He'd left with the family's savings account nearly emptied, along with an unpaid balance on that same trucking loan Curtis had once helped cover, the $11,000 debt Dana had traded my 9 years of marriage to quietly settle for him. It hadn't stayed settled. Marco had let it fall behind again before he disappeared, and now collectors were calling Dana directly, since her name sat on the original paperwork too. The loyalty she'd sold me out for had never actually paid off. It had simply been deferred, waiting to come due at the worst possible moment. My mother asked me, in that same careful, hopeful tone she'd used my whole life, whether I might reconsider, whether family should stretch a little further in hard times. I told her I understood why she believed that. I told her I loved my sister, and that loving someone honestly sometimes means refusing to hand them a version of help that costs you the very thing you finally built for yourself. I told her that if Dana wanted a place to land, she was welcome to earn one, the way I had, one honest step at a time, but she wasn't going to inherit my house the way she'd once inherited my patience, without ever having to account for what it actually cost. A month after that conversation, I called Dana myself, not to reopen the guest room, but to offer something smaller and, I think, more honest. I knew a property manager in town who had a modest 2-bedroom unit opening up near the elementary school, well within what Dana could afford if she picked up steady work. I told her I'd help her fill out the rental application and I'd co-sign if her credit came up short. But the lease, the key, the responsibility, All of it would sit under her own name, not mine. I also mentioned that my business needed someone reliable to manage scheduling and client calls a few mornings a week, work she was more than capable of doing, work that would put her name on a paycheck instead of on someone else's court documents. There was a long pause on the phone. Then she said quietly, "You'd actually still do that, after everything." I told her that helping her build something of her own was never the problem. The problem had been handing over something I'd already built, no questions asked, the way I always used to. Those were two very different kinds of help, and I'd finally learned to tell them apart. It's been almost a year since that morning in the courtroom hallway when I asked my sister a single quiet question and didn't get an honest answer. Dana works for me now, 3 mornings a week, answering client calls and managing my project calendar, and she's good at it, sharper and steadier than I think she's ever had the chance to prove before. She pays her own rent on that 2-bedroom near the school. Some months are tight. She makes them work anyway. We don't talk about the courtroom much. When we do, it's brief, almost businesslike. The way you might mention an old injury that's mostly healed but still aches sometimes in certain weather. My house still stands on that quiet street in Millbrook, the maple trees taller now than the day I planted them, the stone path a little more settled into the earth with each passing season. I sit on that porch some evenings and think about how strange it is that the hardest lesson of my adult life came from the person I trusted most without ever thinking to question it. Trust, I've learned, isn't something you owe someone simply because you share blood or a childhood bedroom or a mother who once told you that you were the steady one. Trust is something people earn through what they do when honesty actually costs them something. My sister learned that lesson the hard way, in a courtroom and then again in an empty bank account. I learned mine on my own front porch, watching a car full of suitcases turn back down my driveway, understanding for the first time that saying no to someone you love isn't cruelty. Sometimes it's the truest form of respect you can offer them, the kind that finally asks them to stand on their own, instead of quietly asking you to keep carrying them. One favor, one betrayal, one soft excuse at a time. I built that house one honest choice at a time, and in the end, it was one honest choice, spoken quietly on my own front steps, that finally let me keep it.